Name for me the only aircraft carrier in history unlucky enough to be sunk. Oh wait, that's a whole bunch of them. I left out one word. Twice! In World War II, the Americans and the Brits used aircraft carriers to great effect. Even Japan used aircraft carriers enormously. Look at Pearl Harbor. So the Germans, being one of the large Axis powers, the other being Japan, of course, why didn't they do the same thing? Sources vary, but by my count, America had 96 aircraft carriers, Britain 82, and Japan 24. Why not Germany? Now, in that count, I've included everything from fleet carriers right on down to MACs. What's a MAC, you say? M-A-C? A MAC is a merchant aircraft carrier. It's a large merchant ship like a grain hauler, bulk grain hauler, or an oil tanker with a relatively flat top that you can add a flight deck to. And what you would do is you would have a squadron of aircraft up there, and they would perform anti-submarine duties, remember the U-boat peril, and they would protect the convoys as best they could, because early on in the war there just weren't enough Allied aircraft carriers to go around to protect all these convoys. And let's face it, nothing protects a convoy from submarines like an aircraft carrier. The Graf Zeppelin's keel was laid down in December 1936 at the Deutsche Werft shipyard in Kiel, Germany. She was launched 25 months later in December 1938. Admiral Erich Raeder, who was in command of Germany's surface fleet, put forth a plan to construct 4 aircraft carriers, Plan Z as it were. After the Graf Zeppelin launch, a sister carrier, the Peter Strasser, was started. However, she didn't make it very far. The hull was partly complete when the order came down to scrap the ship because the war was pulling materials and talent to other projects. The Graf Zeppelin displaced 33,550 tons. She was 263 meters long with a beam of 32 meters and a draft of 8 meters. To give you some scale, she was a bit larger than the American carrier Enterprise of the same era. She was powered by 16 Lamont high-pressure boilers that fed 4 geared steam turbines, which in turn drove 4 screws, producing 200,000 horsepower. The projected top speed was 35 knots. Amazing for a ship of this size. The range was 15,400 kilometers at 19 knots. That's enough to go from Kiel to New York and back with a decent margin. Interestingly, she also had 2 Voith Schneider retractable cycloidal propulsors installed vertically near the bow. They were for docking operations and navigating narrow waterways. They acted as bow thrusters but could thrust in any direction, just like some modern tugs and ferries. In a pinch, they could propel the whole ship at 4 knots and take care of steering as well. Very clever, but no other nation used them for their carriers. Her aircraft complement was initially 30 Fiesler Fi-67T biplanes for scouting and torpedo duties, 10 Messerschmitt Bf-109T fighters, and 13 Junkers Ju-87T dive bombers. The pilot training started at Travemünde. Since the Fiesler was considered an antique biplane and comparatively slow, the airplane complement was later changed to 30 Bf-109 fighters and 12 Ju-87 dive bombers, but the Ju-87s also doubled as torpedo planes. The T stood for Trager, which was German for carrier. You see, adapting land-based airplanes into carrier-based airplanes, that's an ambitious task. The carrier aircraft needed stronger landing gear and associated structural upgrades in addition to the tailhook. Also, folding wings and fuel system changes were required. In most airplanes, the majority of fuel is carried in the wings, which necessitates serious modifications. Remember, landing on an aircraft carrier is in essence a controlled crash. Launching aircraft from the carrier can also be a difficult proposition. While Americans turned their carriers into the wind and firewalled the airplane engines, the Germans developed an unusual compressed air-powered catapult system. But the catapult system was not what you would expect. For starters, the airplanes were crane-lifted onto the launch trolleys in the hangar bay. Landing gear retracted, as required of course, the Bf-109s. Then the airplane and trolley combination had to be brought up to the flight deck where the trolley was hooked to the catapult. Then fire up the airplane engine and launch it. As each airplane was launched, the trolley would shoot off the deck and land in a basket where it was retrieved. It was brought back down to the hangar deck, and the whole process repeated. The compressed air tanks powering the catapults could launch 9 airplanes, one every 30 seconds, until they were exhausted and they needed to recharge from the air compressors. This recharge cycle would take 50 minutes. Unbelievable. Why didn't they just use a steam catapult and bridle system? I don't know. Because what does every aircraft carrier have in abundance? Steam! After launch, the Graf Zeppelin was moved to a nearby construction dock where she could be finished out. Construction slipways were a precious commodity, so a ship's hull was launched as soon as it would float to make room for the next ship in the schedule. Now you would think the Germans would accelerate the work to get the Graf Zeppelin operational as soon as possible. That turned out not to be the case. You see, the Germans had lots of experience in things like tanks, submarines, land-based airplanes, and everything that goes along with a large navy, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the like, but not carriers. This was their first time out of the box with a carrier. It was woefully lacking in several areas. Their ally, Japan, had a lot of experience with carriers. Why didn't they just let Japan build the first few carriers, or at the very least help them in the design and construction? The Graf Zeppelin finish-out was being worked slowly because there were so many other pressing issues taking talent and resources. They couldn't even find enough welders to complete the carrier after launch, much less get it operational. While in dock at Kiel, the decision was made to remove her 15-centimeter guns and use them to defend the recently conquered Norway, while her 10.5-centimeter anti-aircraft guns had already been removed. Despite the setback of armament, work continued, adding an island and smokestacks, setting up the systems, radars, antennas, radios, lots of wiring with those. Extra armor was added to the island and replacements for the anti-aircraft guns were finally installed. The Graf Zeppelin was also dry docked to install the longitudinal hull bulges because it was realized that when she was fully outfitted and loaded out, she would sit too low in the water. In other words, she needed more buoyancy. As a benefit, though, the longitudinal hull bulges could hold more fuel and were the perfect location to act as some torpedo protection. Now that it appears that the Graf Zeppelin was actually getting finished, the Brits took notice, though. You see, the Brits were well versed in carrier construction and operation. They had been keeping an eye on her because they knew that while a battleship was dangerous, an operational carrier was deadly. The Japanese had proved that, and the Americans as well. A raid was planned for late August 1942 at Gottenhafen, where the Graf Zeppelin was currently located. The RAF Lancasters from 97 and 106 squadrons were dispatched with one each 5,500-pound capital ship bomb. While the RAF reported a single direct hit on the Graf Zeppelin, there were no German records or any bomb damage reported for her. After the RAF bombing raid, the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, became so disenchanted that he ordered a halt on all further construction, not only of the Graf Zeppelin, but on all new capital ships that were still under construction. This led Admiral Raeder to send a long letter to Hitler calling this order the cheapest sea victory England ever won. Admiral Raeder was relieved of command shortly thereafter and replaced with the commander of the U-boat fleet, Admiral Karl Donitz. The Graf Zeppelin travels are as follows. She was launched from Kiel shipyard December 1938. She was towed from Kiel to Gottenhafen in July 1940. Then she was towed from Gottenhafen to Stettin in June of 1941 to safeguard against Soviet attacks. Towed from Stettin to Gottenhafen again in November 1941. There she served as a floating warehouse for the Navy's hardwood supply. Towed from Gottenhafen to Kiel in December 1942. She was put in dry dock to add the required hull bulges, among other things. February 1943, all work stopped on the Graf Zeppelin. April 1943, towed from Kiel to Gottenhafen. After that, she was towed from Gottenhafen to Swinemünde. Then from Swinemünde, she was towed to the Pernitz River in Stettin. The Germans sunk her the first time in April 1945 right there. The Soviets were on the edge of town, so the Germans opened the seacocks and blew holes in her hull. They hoped she wouldn't be captured. It didn't work out. From the Parnitz River in Stettin, she was raised by the Soviets in March 1946. Towed from Stettin to Leningrad, she was filled with captured war booty. After that, she was renamed Floating Base PB-101 in February 1947. The Soviets intended to finish and outfit her as a carrier, but in the end that just proved too difficult. Outfitting an aircraft carrier and making it work is an extremely ambitious task. Then in August of 1947, the Soviets decided to see how hard it was to sink an aircraft carrier, so she was towed out into the Baltic Sea. She was still afloat after taking 24 aerial bomb and naval shell hits. The Soviets finally finished her off with 2 torpedoes. She sunk just north of Gottenhaven, which is today's Gdynia, Poland. The German High Command didn't appreciate what they had in the Graf Zeppelin. It was brand new to them. They didn't know how to work an aircraft carrier, and you don't work it alone. You work it in coordination with a task force. They were too steeped in the last war as far as capital ships. Think Bismarck and Tirpitz, lone raiders that went out on the sea. You never do it that way. You have a task force with you. While the Graf Zeppelin did put to sea several times, she was always towed. She never launched or landed an aircraft, not a single time. The Graf Zeppelin, the only German aircraft carrier of the war, and the only aircraft carrier in history that was sunk twice. Now that is a bit of history you probably didn't know.